intensified its battle to sell a war against Iraq. The American public was bombarded with stories of the grave danger posed by Saddam Hussein's alleged weapons of mass destruction. Administration officials spoke of mushroom clouds and smoking guns. In his January State of the Union address, televised across the world, President Bush accused Iraq of attempting to procure uranium from a nuclear weapon for a nuclear weapons program, an accusation that was the linchpin of the administration's justification for war. Though the administration was eventually forced to retract the charge after former U.S. Ambassador to Iraq Joseph Wilson blew the whistle, the damage was done. On March 20th at approximately 5:35 a.m. Baghdad time, the Bush administration unleashed what it bragged was a shock and awe campaign, raining bombs and missiles down on Iraq. U.S. forces poured across Iraq's borders, bombing and shooting their way toward Baghdad and other cities, accompanied by cheerleading journalists who were embedded with the forces. At the onset of the invasion, NBC news anchor Tom Brokaw said, "One of the things we don't want to do is destroy the infrastructure of Iraq, because in a few days we're going to own that country." Dan Rather of CBS said, "Good morning, Baghdad." The 24-hour news coverage on the networks was dominated by an endless string of current and retired generals and other military figures. Many news outlets broke away from the commentaries of the generals only to go live to official briefings at the Pentagon, the State Department, White House, or Central Command in Doha, Qatar. It gave new meaning to the term general news. But most of the rest of the world saw a very different picture. International news agencies, most prominently Al Jazeera and other Arabic language networks, showed the face of war. Civilians trapped under the bombs, the hospitals, the women, children, and men killed by U.S. missiles. The overwhelming majority of people and nations in the world were against the war before it began. The civilian consequences increased the outrage. Though U.S. forces encountered unexpected resistance from Iraqis in the south and north, Washington's massive military power could not be stopped. On April 8th, in one of the most televised moments in history, U.S. forces pulled down the statue of Saddam Hussein in Firdos Square in Baghdad. The U.S. public was inundated with images of jubilant Iraqis dancing in the streets as they dragged the statue's head around the square. What was not reported was that there was only a handful of Iraqis at the event who had been brought in by U.S. forces. In reality, most of the 150 people or so in the square that day were journalists and soldiers. Some of the Iraqis in the square that day were later identified as agents of the Iraqi opposition figure Ahmed Chalabi, who has a long history of working with the CIA. But none of this mattered to the generals and pundits on the networks as they praised the operation for its swiftness and success. On May 1st, in a highly orchestrated event that many viewed as a film shoot for a Bush election campaign ad, the president landed on the deck of the aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln, to declare the end of major combat operations in Iraq. Behind him hung a banner that read, "Mission accomplished." Since then, 340 soldiers have lost their lives in Iraq, the vast majority of the more than 475 killed since the invasion began. President Bush has banned the media from filming the return of the caskets to the United States and has yet to attend a single funeral for a soldier killed in action during his time in power. U.S. soldiers are being killed on almost a daily basis in both Iraq and Afghanistan as resistance to the occupations increase. But the heaviest price has been paid by the civilians of Iraq and Afghanistan. In Iraq alone, some estimates put the number of civilians killed at more than 9,000. 2003 was also a deadly year for journalists. In Iraq, more than a dozen journalists were killed, some of them clearly targeted by U.S. forces. Tariq Ayoub, Al Jazeera's correspondent, was killed on the roof of the Al Jazeera office as he was covering the invasion of Baghdad. The Pentagon knew it was the agency's Baghdad headquarters. It was the same attack. In the same attack, the Baghdad offices of Abu Dhabi TV were also hit, though no journalists were killed. The office of the Reuters news agency at the Palestine Hotel in Baghdad was hit by a rocket launched by U.S. troops. The attack killed 2 journalists, wounded several others. It was a well-known fact that the Palestine was home to more than 100 unembedded journalists. In Baghdad, later in the year, a veteran Reuters cameraman, Mazandana, was killed as he filmed U.S. troops at Abu Ghraib prison in Iraq. Pentagon spokespeople later said they had, quote, engaged a cameraman, having mistook his camera for a rocket-propelled grenade launcher. Today on Democracy Now!, we look back at 2003, a year defined by war, invasion, occupation, and resistance. Later in the program, we'll be speaking with Noam Chomsky, with Katha Pollitt of The Nation magazine, author Michael Parenti, Aarti Shahani of Families for Freedom, as well as former analyst Ray McGovern. But first, we go all the way across the world to Australia, where it just turned to 2004. We're joined by veteran filmmaker, author, and journalist John Pilger. John, it's already next year for you. Tell those of us still stuck in 2003 what we have to look forward to.
Well, I hope you have a much better year in 2004 to look forward to. I suppose I'm not a person for New Year's Eve, having just watched the fireworks explode over Sydney Harbour Bridge, but there is always an element of hope, and I suppose that's a comforting thing, but hope really doesn't figure too much in the way we look at things. We have to analyze them. We have to be aware. We have to ensure that we understand exactly what is happening in the world so that we can comprehend and do something about its dangers. And I don't think it's any different this morning, January the 1st here, than it is with you on the last day of the year.
John, you did the film Breaking the Silence, Truth and Lies in the War on Terror. You've done many films which you are acclaimed for around the world. Very few of them make it onto television here in the United States. Paying the Price, Killing the Children of Iraq, Death of a Nation, about East Timor. Palestine is still the issue. Many films you've done on Cambodia. As you reflect on this year, 2003, how does it compare?
Well, it compares very badly in terms of lost lives and lost opportunities. The war, rather, let's not dignify it as a war. The invasion happened, and you described that very accurately as really quite a cowardly act. It was an enormous event of the world's most powerful military machine crushing a defenseless country. I think back of the propaganda welcome back to Portsmouth in England of a nuclear-powered submarine which had fired cruise missiles from way off somewhere into Iraq. Now, I think the total cost of these cruise missiles was something like that it fired was something like $5 million or something like that. But the point was that it was firing them at a nation made up of about 40% of children, a suffering nation, a nation that had endured a decade of the most vicious embargo, more like a medieval siege, which had been driven by British governments and American governments. And here was a submarine just firing these monsters into a country that effectively, well, certainly had no air force, had no missiles, had no anything really, and its army packed up. I thought, I mean, that was simply a metaphor, of course. It was a real metaphor, but it was a metaphor for what had happened during the whole monstrous shock and awe campaign. So that loss of life, you mentioned 9,000. I think that's really the bottom figure. Robert Fisk, not long ago, described in one day touring the morgues of Baghdad, and he reckoned that something like 1,000 people a week were dying as a result, direct and indirect, of the occupation.
John, we only have a minute, and I wanted to ask, in addition to the occupation and the invasion, about resistance. Months ago, we broadcast the protest footage from Britain. You were one of those who spoke in the massive anti-war protests that took place there. Right now, you're in Sydney, Australia, which is the area where